Wow, look at you all. So, I was waiting for my flight 2 days ago at San Francisco International Airport, and sitting directly across from me was a young, attractive woman. She wore heavy makeup, and she had long, lacquered nails, and a skimpy top that was riding up just enough to reveal a pretty gaudy belly piercing. So I had a shock of surprise when she stood up to board her flight, and I saw the title of the book that she had been engrossed in all this time, Fundamentals of Angel Investing. So this was deliciously ironic for me because my topic is bias. I graduated with a science degree from UC Berkeley in 1984. And it was hard studying science at Berkeley, and it wasn't just because of the content. I was the target of frequent, undeniable, in-my-face sexism. But this was also a time of celebration and optimism for women. We were the first generation in history where female college graduates outnumbered males. We were flooding into the marketplace in unprecedented numbers and into fields where before we'd had little to no representation. And we naively thought that our generation would be the one to make gender inequity a thing of the past. But here we are, it's 30 years later, and the conversation remains much the same. Young female scientists tell me stories that are heartbreakingly similar to those early experiences. We still have a substantial pay gap and shockingly few women at the top. Only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women and 18% of Congress. Oddly, we are 51% of the population, yet occupy only 15% of lead roles in movies. And my world, Silicon Valley, is one of the few places where you might encounter this scene at a major conference during the bathroom break. So, as a woman, I find it disheartening and angering and really, frankly, boring to still be in this conversation. And I imagine as a man, it gets old having the finger always pointing back at you. The tolerance for this conversation is wearing thin, and this is nowhere more evident than in the insult-laden, often vulgar, and sometimes violent comment streams accompanying any online discussion of a gender-related issue. But these conversations leave out a powerful and invisible actor in our story. All of us, male and female, are unconsciously gender biased. And these biases lead well-meaning men and women to do things that perpetuate the status quo without our ever knowing it. So until as a society we can get our arms around this phenomenon, we are unwitting accomplices in the perpetuation of inequity and discrimination. So let's take a look at the brain processes that drive bias, how it shows up, and most importantly, what are some things that we can do about it? Most people think that they move through their day making their decisions with a conscious and rational process of deliberation. And by this logic, it's difficult to do something that's out of keeping with your values without knowing that you've done so. But actually, conscious decision-making represents a tiny, tiny fraction of what goes on in your brain. You couldn't possibly take in the oncoming barrage of information moment to moment, process it, and formulate a response to it with this part of the brain alone. It needs help. And what it calls on is a vast reservoir of unconsciously stored associations. You see, as you move through your day, outside of your awareness, your brain is always scanning for repeating patterns. And when it finds them, it stores them as the way things are or ought to be. But the problem with this process, which actually works well most of the time, is that your brain is also not differentiating around the utility or the fairness or the accuracy of what the environment is serving up. If it's associated out there, it's likely to become associated in here. And it is these associations that we use to make meaning of the world and to formulate our response to it. Now, we can measure unconscious associations quite easily with an elegant and simple instrument called the implicit association test. Quite simply for gender, all it does is ask you to associate certain words with the image of a man or a woman. And when those requested associations match your unconscious association, you're going to be able to do these tasks more quickly and with fewer errors. So most people in the population, as it turns out, male or female, regardless of political orientation, have an easier time associating words like leader, strong, protective toward men, and nurturing, emotional, and fragile toward women. 16 million people have taken the implicit association test to date, and the results are clear. If you grew up here in the United States, or for that matter, most parts of the world, you likely have a significant degree of gender bias. Okay, so where do those biases come from? I mean, where are all these associations hanging out? Well, just do a search on the internet for any profession and add the modifier male or female in front of it and see what comes up. In this case, the search was on female executive. And as strange as the second image is, the most troubling one for me personally at my age is the last one, because the subheading is aged female executive. Yeah. It comes from the things we receive from social media. In this case, a recommendation of the top minds and big ideas that I should be following. There are 22 images, and only 2 of them are female. It shows up in the notoriously lopsided gender ratios at professional conferences. And even the backgrounds tell a story. It also shows up in headlines. In this case, Fortune magazine felt it necessary to reassure us that Marissa Mayer is the real deal, because as a blonde, attractive young woman, we might assume she wasn't. So media is not benign, because it is this sort of imagery that our brains use unconsciously in our calculations of who belongs where and what competence looks like. A Yale University study looked at bias in the hiring for the traditionally male role of police chief. And in this study, purportedly gender-blind participants were asked to review 2 applications. Now, when no names were attached, they overwhelmingly preferred the application that had more education. But when a male or female name was attached, they overwhelmingly preferred the application with a male name. And this sort of result has been replicated in numerous other academic studies. But these unconscious biases don't just cause discrimination, they also influence our life choices. A University of Washington study recently looked at the effect of classroom decor on the choice of academic discipline. So researchers decorated 2 classrooms. One of them had kind of traditionally nerdy male paraphernalia in it, like Star Trek posters and comic books and video games. And the other one had neutral objects, like coffee cups and plants and art posters. What they found was that female college students who spent time in this traditionally nerdy classroom exhibited a markedly lower preference for computer science as a field than the females who spent time in the neutral room. But for males, it made no difference whatsoever. When you really look, this kind of bias shows up everywhere. It's in what we choose to share with whom and whose opinion we seek. It infects our assumptions about who should do domestic chores and who deserves the praise for doing so. It shows up, yeah. It shows up for that lone female on the technology team, when her recommendations are disproportionately overlooked or second-guessed. But she can't say anything about this, and the phenomenon will likely remain invisible to her male colleagues. Why? Because to do so is potentially career-limiting. It marks her out as that woman, you know, the one that plays the gender card. So it shows up everywhere. It shows up in our definitions of leadership, and when vulnerability and sharing credit are seen as weak, and when taking up space and personal ambition are seen as strong. Gender equity is not a woman's issue. We need women to fully participate in the conversations that shape the future of the world. But it's not just women who benefit. Men benefit too, because when we associate masculinity with money and muscles and domination and aggression, we dishonor legions of good men who do not embody these characteristics. No piece of legislation or mandatory sexual harassment training or quota will get rid of unconscious bias. These things are necessary. But when we focus only on overt sexism, we miss the point. And worse yet, we allow ourselves to point our finger at a hypothetical bad guy out there. But when we allow ourselves to understand that we are biased too, we're able to transform this conversation from one of blame and shame to one of committed action. Believing in gender equity is not enough. We are the creators and the consumers of the environments that drive bias. So what can we do about it? There's actually a fairly simple solution, and that is to commit yourself to becoming a good observer of your environment. Make it a daily practice, and if you need to, remind yourself. In fact, you might even notice something today as a result of the last 10 minutes we've spent together. But if you do, don't judge it, because we all do it. Don't judge it. Engage with other people. Get curious. And use it to fuel an exploration. When you see bias or the environments that drive it, say something, talk about it, and where you can, change it. And this is for the men in the audience. Women can't and shouldn't take this one on by ourselves. We need you to pick up the mantle alongside us. So let's help each other. Let's help each other change these limiting narratives of what it means to be a man or a woman. Because nobody here is to blame for this problem, but we are all together responsible for a solution. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to present you all with a question. Here is my question. Against the backdrop of the current economic crisis in Europe, combined with the debate, the ongoing debate of legislation tied to quota legislation for women on boards, plus all of the assertions that are now being made in the press that women represent the critical engine for global economic growth, does this represent the perfect storm? Are we finally at a point where considerations of women's legitimate leadership potential is recognized and interpreted in terms of corporate advancement? It's a complicated question. And I often think back to one of my first experiences, roughly 20 years ago, and that is, in some sense, my informal metric. And let me explain to you what happened. I was invited to join an evaluation committee in New York. I didn't know really what to expect. And I went to a rather elaborate ballroom for this meeting, and I opened the door, and there was a sea of white men. And suddenly this man came running up to me, and he said, "Oh, I'm the black, you must be the woman." He was right. So where does that leave us? And are we, in fact, making progress? Because certainly if you consider statistical evidence currently, it doesn't look particularly positive. So let me just examine some statistics in Europe. Currently, 3% of the top 50 companies in Europe are led by women. Women are 1.5 relative to 10 men on corporate boards. And globally, women MBAs are hired at a lower level, fewer promotions, less opportunity in terms of equitable compensation, even controlling for location, geography, function, industry, parental status, years of work before and after the MBA. So what is going on? Research seems to suggest that the challenge is a rather interesting one, and that is the perpetuation of gender-based stereotypes and unconscious bias. So what does that mean? And I remember once speaking to a dual career couple, and they gave me the perfect example that I think manifests why this is so challenging. This particular couple consists of an individual. He is an economist, a law professor, published author. She is a pediatric surgeon and a hospital administrator. And they have a young son, and they have a reasonably good working arrangement whereby she typically drops off their son in the morning, and her partner picks up the son in the afternoon. And this particular day, this was not going to work because she had a very early surgery scheduled that morning. So he took the son to the Kinderkrippe, and just as he was handing the son over, the son threw up all over him. So he was covered with vomit. Quickly grabbed a towel, wiped it off, went running to the classroom, and his student said, "There's something going on with the jacket." And he said, yes, I apologize. I had to drop off my son. Oh, he was not even able to finish his comment. The students, oh my word, tenured professor, author, juggling all of this, and you take your son. And he thought this was fantastic. So when he went home, he shared with his wife. Here's the feedback. She said, "Stop right there. Let me tell you the other version of this story. I come to the hospital with vomit on my jacket. Here's what is not said. Oh, I don't know that she can multitask. She can't handle the stress. She wasn't able to change her jacket." So same behavior, different interpretations. So we did a very interesting study in 2006 where we took 953 managers across Europe. We said, we have a very interesting question to ask you. We have identified the 14 key leadership attributes, and we would like to find out from you, do you more typically associate this attribute with a man or a woman? So, for example, team building, influencing upwards, problem solving. What was remarkable was almost without exception, all of the attributes that were deemed to be taking charge behaviors, men, by virtue of simply being men, were perceived to be more competent at that behavior. And women, simply by virtue of being women, were perceived to be more competent at taking care. Now, what does that mean? It does not mean that it is good or bad to take charge or take care. It simply means that irrespective of assessments of performance, even before someone has performed, there is an inclination to believe that you will see this attribute in someone. So clearly, there are default perceptions. We think the word leader, we think man, we think the word diversity, we think women. And there's also a very real danger that what we underestimate, we underutilize. And the third challenge is that we are gauging potential around performance, leadership, ambition, based on physically apparent differences alone. And let me share an example that I think challenges this. A company has a number of different networks where they're trying to really identify how to build an inclusive work environment. And this particular company had a women's network, had an LGBT network, had a people of color network, and they had a commuter network. The commuter network was for employees who traveled in excess of 1.5 hours to get to work. So this particular day, they were celebrating all of the networks, and the vice chairman came and opened the door to that network, the commuters network. And in that room were 8 men and 1 woman. And he turned to the woman and said, "Why are you here? Why aren't you in the women's network?" And she said, "Because my issue is my commute. My issue is not my gender." And he suddenly realized that he had made the very mistake that he had hoped these networks would address, which was the inclination to come to very precipitous assessments of talent, interests, commitments, and so forth based on physically apparent differences. So what do we do about this? What are the solutions? I think the solutions are fundamentally being aware of fundamental challenges tied to these issues. 1, mindsets matter. Perceptions, stereotypes, and so forth dictate what we tend to look for and what we expect to find. The other interesting challenge, and research confirms this, ironically enough, and this is very surprising, there are actually more differences among women and among men than between men and women. And yet we tend to think that women are a monolithic group and men are a monolithic group, and it's simply not the case. And I think, too, that in this day and age, when we want to really celebrate the potential and the opportunities for talent, we have to be very, very careful not to be predisposed to expect to see talent in a certain form. So what is a very practical intervention that has great potential? I often call it the power of discernment, the ability to notice difference. And I had a very interesting personal experience a couple of years ago that absolutely confirmed that I was suffering from a total lack of discernment this particular day. I was working in Japan, and I was driving a car that had no side view mirror and no rear view mirror. And I was driving with a Japanese colleague, so I was completely dependent on this colleague to help me navigate. And we were driving along, accessing a highway, and I said, "Yamato-san, is there a car coming?" And he said, "No." So, of course, I proceed to accelerate. He said, "It's a large truck." And we were within about 4 inches of a close encounter with a stone wall. And I just thought, oh my word, but he was absolutely right. And I think this is the message that I wish to leave with you. We have to get to a point where we can discern difference, where we can celebrate and develop workplaces that actually leverage these differences, not that we expect confirmation and compilation of stereotypes that frankly are getting in the way of accurate assessments and advancement of talent. And I believe we are on the cusp of a whole new, brave new workplace where the possibilities of working virtually, where people's gender is not the relevant determinant of the capacity to lend contributions that will certainly contribute to the economic and social well-being of our society. Thank you very much.
How you doing? How you doing? Wow, I feel like a rock star or a guest on the Daily Show or something. This is amazing. I want to thank the folks from TEDx Bloomington for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. And I got to tell you, this feels like a homecoming for me. I was at IU on the 7-year plan. So I kind of got to know the city and the people here pretty well when I was here 25 years ago. Did you get that? 25 years ago? And one thing, after I got settled in the city, one thing happened to me every year without fail. Somebody would drive by me, usually in a pickup truck, sometimes with a few friends, and they would call me a nigger. Now, the first time that happened, I just froze. I was like one of those red-shirted Star Trek security guys. You know, we used to call him Yeoman Johnson. So I'm there like Yeoman Johnson, certain that a beatdown is in my future, and it didn't happen. But what did happen is that every year, like clockwork, it was like a rite of spring or something. The snow would go away, the flowers would come out, and somebody would say, "Hey, nigga." Not in a friendly way. So I say that not to disparage the city, not to disparage this wonderful university, just to point out that even in a place as cool as Bloomington, even in a school as wonderful as Indiana University, there are still some corners, some pockets where stereotypes and prejudice rear their ugly heads. So I decided to bring to you this talk about jumping in to a talk about race across racial lines. All right, I see you guys are nervous already. So, since I left IU, I've kind of gone on and I've written about this and I've talked about this and I've thought about this. And I found that there's two big obstacles to this conversation. White folks get too guilty and defensive and black folks get too mad. But I'm really convinced that at the root of that is a difference in how different people perceive racial progress. Now, researchers at Stanford and Yale universities, they looked into this. They asked people, different persuasions, different ethnicities, how do you judge racial progress? And it turns out that black folks compare where we are now to where we ought to be. This imagined future where we're all equal. And white folks compare where we are right now to where we used to be, the journey that we made. So you ask a white person, where are we on racial progress? And they go, well, you know, we're not segregated anymore. You can have the kind of job you want regardless of who you are. We have a black president. Can you believe that? Things seem pretty cool. You ask a black person about racial progress, and they go, well, let's see, I get followed around by security every time I go in a store. I earn about 75% of what a white guy just like me earns. I'm 12 times more likely to get prison time if I get arrested on a drug charge than a white person. I'm more likely to end up on death row. You know what? Maybe things aren't quite where they need to be, right? For black folks and people of color, racial issues are security goals. They're as primal as putting food on your table or taking care of your family. Now, for a lot of white folks, racial issues are nurturance goals. They're things you do to make the world a better place. Not quite as primal as a security goal. So we're seeing the same data, we're seeing the same universe, we're just using different yardsticks to judge it. So these conversations are about inspiring people to think, right? They're about taking these thoughts. Often when we think about race, it's an implicit thought. It's something in the back of our heads. We don't think about it directly. They rattle around in the side of our brains, and they're reflex actions. And the goal of this conversation is to bring that stuff to the forefront and make you think about it. Now, I can only guarantee one thing if you have these conversations. It is going to be uncomfortable. But I tell you what, if it's uncomfortable, that means you're doing it right. Now, this reminds me a little bit of a man I met on my travels. As I've written about this stuff, I met a man by the name of Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr. And he's an expert on civil rights and talking across race and racial reconciliation. He teaches at Emory University, and he also teaches at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Atlanta. And he told me about the concept of how legal segregation, back when segregation was legal in America, it was horizontal segregation. So when people were waiting in line or when people were in an elevator, they didn't really segregate by race, but they segregated restaurants and they segregated movie theaters. They segregated churches. They segregated where people sit down. Because when you sit down and you sit next to somebody, you're more likely to see them as your equal. And you're more likely to see what you have in common with them. So I guess the question becomes, how do we, in a digital age, learn to sit together? Now, I'm convinced we got to have some ground rules. Number one, we got to say nobody owns this issue. Now, I know we're used to people of color bringing up this stuff because it's a security issue after all. But white folks, I'm here to tell you, you have a racial culture too. And it's time for you to jump into this conversation as well, because believe it or not, you have just as much at stake as we do. And let me tell you something else. Talking about race does not equal racism. Let me say that one more time. Talking about race does not equal racism. Because a lot of times when you want to talk about race, people are going to turn that around. I was called a race baiter by Bill O'Reilly on his show on Fox News. Now, my reaction was, if Bill O'Reilly's calling me a racist, I must be doing something okay. But anyway. I gotta say, to me, calling someone a race baiter or a racist for wanting to talk about race is like calling the guy who's trying to keep you from stepping in a pothole the pothole. There's already a ditch in the road. I'm just trying to keep you from stepping in it. Another important point. We only talk about race issues in a crisis. When Trayvon Martin, a 16-year-old black boy, gets killed in a Florida subdivision, or when a respected academic like Henry Louis Gates gets arrested in his home by the police who are investigating a report of a robbery, okay, now we want to talk about racial profiling, and now we want to talk about how people of color get treated by the police. But by then, people are polarized. They're angry. They're set in their ways. They're not willing to be open. They're not willing to challenge themselves. It's really hard to talk in an environment like that. Whenever somebody does something that's questionable, stereotypical, or racist, the first thing we want to do is say, is that guy a bigot? Is that guy a racist? What is wrong with that guy? Now, believe me, I understand the impulse. But to me, that almost outsources racism to racists and bigots. And you know what? That's a myth. That only bigots can act on stereotypes or prejudice. As a matter of fact, I think prejudice is kind of seductive. It explains the world to us. It allows us to go into situations where we don't know anybody and we can prejudge. I can say, oh, that guy likes rock music, or oh, I better be careful of that guy, right? But in the end, it's not particularly accurate. Words matter. Now, for me, the word racism is like a DEFCON 5 level word, right? I hardly ever use it. I prefer words like bias, prejudice, stereotypes, feeling uncomfortable, spilkes, whatever, whatever works. Because that way we can edge it back a little bit. Talk about things that aren't quite at that big level. Because the important thing to remember is that ugly as stereotypes and racism are, prejudice is also kind of seductive. It draws us in. It can be funny. It can be entertaining. One of the things that's interesting to me about this time in our culture is that now that we have a black president, I sense so many people going, oh, Fowler, I don't have to talk about this anymore. You guys got a black president. What more do you want? Right? But what people don't understand is that because we have a black president, that conversation is only getting started. As we get more diverse as a nation, as we grow more diverse as a nation, these conversations are only going to happen more and more. So maybe it's time to get engaged. Maybe it's time to get involved. Maybe it's time to jump in. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Wow, the people up in the balcony, too. I am delighted to be here today. You've heard that I'm in health, and a lot of my work is on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. But what I'm going to do today is empower all of us with tools for communicating about race and racism. I see the world in allegories. Sometimes I just look at an ordinary situation and I get some insight about how to communicate about very complex ideas. So today I'm going to share with you 4 allegories on race and racism that I hope you will understand, remember, and then pass them on. The first story, Japanese Lanterns, Colored Perceptions, was sparked by my own real experience back in the day when I was at this very nice garden party in the evening in California. And I had my turn with chitting and chatting, and I was just sort of tired, and I wanted to just sit back in the corner of the garden and relax and listen to the conversation and music just wash over me. And as I sat there in the garden, I became fascinated by a group of pink moths. And then I looked a little further on and I saw a group of green moths and a group of blue moths. And so not only was I fascinated by that, I was fascinated by how they naturally were sorting according to their kind. And then I looked over my shoulder and I saw, wow, and there's some yellow moths and some purple moths and some orange moths too. And the scientist in me was getting very excited about this until I was like, oh, of course. There is no such thing as purple or pink or blue or green or yellow or orange moths. Moths are different colors, yes, but they're different colors of brown and tan and speckled and splotched. But the colors that I thought I was seeing and the colors that we think we see every day are actually due to the lights by which we look. These colored lights distort and mask our own true variability, which can only be seen under a universal light that allows all possibility. So when I remembered this image, I started thinking, what is race? And how do the racial categories that we construct color our imaginations of who we are? And in my mind, race is clearly a social classification, not a biological descriptor. It is the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. So here in Atlanta, in the United States, by the colored lights that we look at, I'm clearly black. But in some parts of Brazil, with different colored lights, I'm clearly colored, clearly white, actually. And in South Africa, I'm clearly colored. And so we need to challenge ourselves to understand the impact of these different colored racial categories that we construct and how it's limiting our understanding of our own true variability. The second story, Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. This was also from my time back as a medical student in California. And I had been studying with some friends. It was getting late. We'd missed dinner. And so we went into town to get something to eat. And we walk into a restaurant, and we sit down. We order our food. Our food is served, and here we are eating. And that's not remarkable. Many of you have had that experience. And I wouldn't have thought anything more about it or be talking about it today, except that I looked up and I noticed a sign. And that sign was provided me a profound insight about racism. So what did the sign say? The sign said open. Now, I could have thought nothing more about that, right? I was sitting at the table of opportunity eating with a sign that proclaimed open to me. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that, in fact, people who were hungry but just a few feet away from me on the other side of the sign would not be able to come in because, in fact, now the restaurant was closed due to the hour. And I realized that racism and other systems of inequity structure open-closed signs in our society. And it's important for us to know something about the two-sided nature of these signs. It's important for us to understand how these signs, how racism and all of the other isms create a dual reality, where on one side, people who are in the side, for any of us, it's difficult for us to recognize any system of inequity that is privileging us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white people in this country to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the world context. Yet, for those on the other side of the sign, they are very well aware of the two-sided nature of the sign, because it's proclaiming close to them, and yet they can see through the window and see that people are eating on the other side. So back inside the restaurant, I understand that people might ask, does racism really exist? Is there really a two-sided sign? Because in fact, it's hard to know when all you ever see is open. It's a privilege, in fact, not to have to know about the two-sided nature of the sign. But once you do know, you can act. You don't have to act, but you can choose to act, and the knowledge about racism and its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation is actually empowering. The third of my, let me just, before I get off of that, now provide you with a definition of racism that evolves out of this understanding. And I'm really clear that racism is a system. It's not an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested. But it's a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is that opportunity structured? And on what basis is that value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race. And what are the impacts of this system of power? Well, it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, but it doesn't take very long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that it's also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And then even as it's unfairly disadvantaging or advantaging individuals and communities, this system is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. My third story, Levels of Racism, A Gardener's Tale, comes from my experience when my husband and I, newlywed, bought our first freestanding house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes all along the porch. Now, when we went to plant our marigold seeds, we saw some of the boxes had dirt in them and some of the boxes were empty. So my husband dutifully goes to the gardening store and he's hauling big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes and we put equal numbers of seeds in all the boxes. And we water all of the boxes. And I'm not the gardener, so I sit back, just going to enjoy. And 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door and I stopped in my tracks, because it looked to me like we had planted completely different species in some of the boxes versus others. In some of the boxes, they were full of plants, tall and vigorous looking plants, and other boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil was rich, fertile soil, so that in the potting soil, every single seed had sprouted, with the strong seed growing very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed making it to a middling height. But in that old soil, that poor rocky soil that we had found there, the weak seed had died. And even the strong seed had to struggle to make it halfway up. And if you guys garden, well, maybe you've composted half of your garden and you've seen the same thing. This image is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. And I'm going to make it a story about racism. But before I do that, I want to talk to you just a little bit more about racism, because in this story, I'm going to illustrate 3 different levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And so, you know, sometimes I have an hour to talk about these things. I don't today, but I'm just going to quickly define each of them, make some important points, and then share the story. Institutionalized racism, what is it? It is that system that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws and our norms, and actually often shows up as inherited disadvantage. These are some examples of how it can impact you. Sometimes people look at my top bullet of housing, education, employment, and wealth, and they ask, isn't that social class? Why do you have this on a slide about racism? To which I respond, it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That's not just a happenstance. But for each marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized group, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, for example, it was the taking of the land and the genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to the reservations. For people of African descent, it was the kidnapping of West African people, and then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people stop me there and they say, well, you know what, Dr. Jones, you're talking about slavery. But the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and that's fully 149 years ago now. So all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. And all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still what I describe as contemporary, present-day structural factors that are perpetuating the initial historical insult. And so when people ask me, am I talking about racism or social class, I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. Before I get off of this, I need to also say that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, and often shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So here now we're talking about what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice and the discrimination, lots of ways that it can impact your health and your whole well-being. And like institutionalized racism, it can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, but even more important, it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You don't have to intend it to have a racist impact, to do something racist to have a racist impact. Third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Lots of ways that it can affect us, and it's really about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So now, with this background about what I describe as these 3 levels of racism, let's go back to the story. So here I have now 2 flower boxes. But what we're going to introduce is a gardener. A gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the flowers are going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the flowers are going to produce red blossoms. And this gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and she takes the pink seed and she throws it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she sees in her garden what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the seed has sprouted. The strong seed has grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak red seed has made it to a middling height. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And here comes the strong pink seed, just trying to make it halfway up. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And then year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there for a minute to say that this first part of the story tells us something about institutionalized racism, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But okay, well, let's pick the story back up. Where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, now the gardener is looking at red, thinking that red is mighty beautiful. She looks over the pink flowers and she says, oh, they sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she sees that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil and she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that still goes on. And where is internalized racism in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, and then up to another pink flower, bzzz, and then it comes toward this other pink flower, and that pink flower says, get away from me, bee. Do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in the garden? Well, let's start with addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, right? And that's an important intervention. That's an important intervention, but as you can see, even if you do that, that's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. Or maybe you say, okay, let's deal with the personally mediated racism. So let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't, right? But even if she does, it still won't change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we really want to set things right in the garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep separate boxes too, that's all right too, but if we do, it means that we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious as the red. And in that intervention, we might also address the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, we also might address the personally mediated. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So, in this story, I've actually illustrated these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and very strongly suggested that if we want to set things right, we have to address the institutionalized racism. Good if we address all the levels at the same time. But the most important question is one that I haven't raised yet, and that is, who is the gardener, right? Because the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Well, who is the gardener? The gardener clearly includes government, as well as media, as well as foundations and corporations, and even communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink, right? And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, because she's not even really keeping the pink flowers as part of her garden. And our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Lots of different questions that can come out of this story. But I'm going to close in this last minute with one last image. And this image is not from my own real experience, but actually this is an image taken from the book by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. And in that image, she presents racism as a conveyor belt on which people are just living their ordinary lives, not really understanding that they're moving to and through racism, but just living their ordinary lives and contributing to racism by their benign inaction. So I'm going to build on this story, get back on the conveyor belt over here, to help us know how can we act. So here we are on this crowded conveyor belt, and we're just living our lives, most of us not even paying attention or even wondering where we're going. But say one of us looks up and we see racism. Well, one reaction is to close your eyes. That's denial, right? Or another reaction is to turn around. You're still going in the same direction. Maybe you're colorblind. But if we do not, and you know what that shows you? That shows you that racism is most often passive. Most often shows up as inaction in the face of need. But if we're on this conveyor belt and we don't want to go there, then what we have to do is start walking backwards, right? And we need to walk at least as fast as it's going, not to go that way. But now we have to start walking faster if we don't want to. We really want to get away from that. And what happens when you start walking backwards on a crowded conveyor belt? You bump into people and they say, hey, buddy, watch out. Where are you going? And this is your opportunity to do the first of 3 steps in terms of being actively anti-racist, and that is to name racism. You say, look, do you see where we're going? Do you want to go there? And most people will say, just stop bothering me. But maybe 1 or 2 will turn around with you. So now you're 2 or 3 walking backwards on this conveyor belt. And now where are you headed? You're not just going away from racism, but now you're actually going to understand the conveyor belt motor. And now you're going to do the second of the 3 stages of anti-racism, which is to ask, how is racism operating here? And so maybe one of you thinks it's a lever, and you pick the lever up, and the belt jolts because the lever is part of it. But it's a very smart conveyor belt, so whoop, it reconfigures itself and keeps going. So now you have to do the third thing to be actively anti-racist, which is to organize and strategize to act with others who are on the other side, trying this dial or trying this button. And I believe that we together can dismantle the system and put in its place a system in which all of us can know our full potential and have the opportunity to develop to our full potential. So I have shared with you 4 allegories. Japanese Lanterns talks about race as a social construct. Dual reality illustrates racism as a system that creates a 2-sided sign. A dual reality. Levels of racism illustrates 3 levels of racism and highlights the fact that if we want to set things right, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism. And life on a conveyor belt motivates us to act. I hope that you've understood these stories. I hope that you'll find them useful tools, and I hope that you carry them out into the world. Thank you very much.
You ever wonder what it will take to really end racism? Well, I'd like to share with you a little bit of my experience with that question by doing 3 things. Talking about what racism is, as I've come to understand it, what can actually be done about it, and why I think it matters for everyone. So first to definitions. When I was a kid, I thought racism was principally about being called the N-word, or being underestimated, or having a contest rigged so that I didn't get the prize that I actually had won on the basis of my performance. But I've come to learn that it is so much more than that. It is an entire system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. And it was created to justify a hierarchy, political, economic, social, on this false idea that white people are at the top and everybody else is at the bottom, kind of on a ladder. It has both external dimensions that you can see out there in the world and internal dimensions that are inside of all of our hearts and minds. And so I'm going to talk a little about some of those external things, and then we'll talk about the internal and how they play off of each other. So you can see racism sometimes in the single decisions of an individual. Like research shows that a hiring manager is more likely to call in for an interview someone whose name is John than Juan or Jamal or Bin, even if the resume is exactly the same, just the name at the top is different. Sometimes it shows up in the way companies make decisions, like putting unhealthy, inferior, or toxic processes or products in Black and Latino neighborhoods, which happens way more still than you'd like to imagine. it shows up in incredible gaps in outcomes, like things like the persistent infant mortality rate being higher for kids of color, even when the parents have the same access to healthcare, education, financial resources. There are still these gaps in outcomes. And you can see it in the consequences of sweeping acts of public policy. Take, for instance, the taking of Native American lands and then re-granting to white settlers and to homesteaders. Take the pouring of $120 billion of federally backed home loans into suburbs after World War II that were, by definition, exclusively white. And the gap in wealth that just those two things created has spanned generations, and it will take us a very long time to catch up. So when you ask yourself, why are some neighborhoods poor and some neighborhoods rich, there are actually decisions, public policy, investments that have built that inequality. And so it's not about a given person's individual activity or motivation or skill. There's a whole system behind what we see as those outcomes. So that's the external. Now, on the inside, there are all kinds of stereotypes that we are swimming in and come out of us in the way we tell ourselves who's beautiful and who's smart and who's scary and what it takes to get ahead and what it means when people don't. Think of how you answer that question. And it also lives inside of us in terms of unconscious bias. And I want to give you a little dip into the science of unconscious bias to see what I mean by that. So if you wouldn't mind to read out the color of each line of text as quickly as you can. Just shout it out. All right, one more. And one more. Yeah, that one was a little trickier. And here's why. Because our brains needed to take an extra split second to bypass the connections between the color of the letters and the meaning of the words. We have those unconscious connections between dirt and brown and sunshine and yellow and so forth. This slide messes with that. And unconscious bias works exactly the same way. We have to, those stereotypes I was mentioning, they provide the unconscious kind of operating system that helps us make sense of the world around us. And our conscious thoughts and our conscious behavior get driven by those unconscious processes. And you can see this. I'm going to tell you a story about my husband. See how those unconscious things then manifest themselves in conscious, more conscious aspects of racism. So Anthony is a dark-skinned African-American man, and he lived in Georgetown in D.C. in the 90s when there were not very many black residents. His neighbor's kids had a very loud party one night, and he and his roommates went out to see what was happening. Somebody called the police. When the officers came, she asked each of his roommates, who were both white, who are you and why are you out here? And he said, each of them said, I live over there. And she said, okay, and moved on. When she got to Anthony, he gave the same answer, I live over there. And she said, I need to see a key. And then he produced the key. She said, put it in the lock, open that door. So he did. Now, his roommates had never seen anything like this. They were furious, they were shocked, they wanted to call the write an op-ed and all that. He was angry, but not surprised, because that kind of profiling was a fact of his life, and it is a fact of life for people of color. Day in and day out, it still goes on. Whether it is a teacher deciding whether to send a kid to the principal or not, whether it is a social worker deciding whether to remove a child from their family or to serve a family intact, whether it is a judge deciding whether to give probation or a sentence, an incarceration. The unconscious processing about who you can trust, who's likely to do the right thing, it drives the conscious decision-making and it drives unequal results. And that's where the unconscious and the external stuff kind of play off of each other. I will tell you that as a parent of 3 black sons, I and many other parents of color this summer in particular have had to tell them, again, a story we tell way too much. We have to tell our kids that on the one hand, if you work hard, you will get ahead, and you've got to work hard and apply yourself. And on the other hand, you have to tell them that life is really stacked against you in a certain kind of way. And if you're a boy of color, if you're a young man of color, you could be perceived as a threat, and that kind of perception of you as threat could mean your life. It could mean your life. If somebody mistakenly thinks you are a dangerous person, it could mean your life. As a parent, it is a heartbreaking thing to have to tell your kid that and to know that it is real. It happens. Now, That is the bad news, and there's a lot of bad news to be sure. The good news is that while unconscious bias is wired into our neural processing, it is not permanent. And if we surround ourselves with relationships with people, with understandings of history, with different kinds of images, we can shift that neural processing. We can shift, in a way, the operating system that becomes the background for our conscious choices and our conscious actions, and we can make a difference. And we've got to take on that internal work and the external work at the same time. And there's more good news there. My colleagues and I have come to a bit of a formula that we've seen work. When you take networks of people who build the will, the skill, the knowledge, and the strategies together to eliminate racism, they can actually make progress. So a few quick stories about some of those elements. On the network side, we worked with a group in a northeastern state. They wanted to see every kid get to kindergarten healthy and ready to learn. They've done great work with individual families over the years, but there are gaps that remained. And they decided, we're going to bring together a completely different collection of people, parents and educators and business people and researchers and early childhood educators and more, to take on together the responsibility for equity, about making sure the outcomes actually work for all kids, even though it would take different things for different kids to get there. And that commitment to equity became the glue, so that now these organizations who used to work right in their own boundaries of their discipline are now crossing those institutional boundaries to make it easier for people, families, to get access to what they need so that they can achieve their dreams for themselves and for their kids. Sometimes working against racism can be tough. I can imagine you might think that. And the will itself has to be built. We were working with a group of juvenile justice officials who were learning how racism works in their field and what they could do about it. And one of the participants wasn't so enthusiastic until it got personal. I had asked them, could you please share your racial identity and a story about that? And when it got to Joe, he said, I'm Italian American. And I said, excellent. Now tell us how you identify racially. And he looked at me like a deer in a headlight. And eventually he said white. He told me later that he was probably in his mid-40s, had never thought of himself as white until that moment. But once he understood that there was this system of advantage that he benefited from, without his active consent or desire or anything, and once he started to see how racism operates very practically in his area of work and what he could do about it, he is on fire and he will never be the same. Sometimes you need a little skill. You might have the desire, but when I was starting to learn about this stuff, I was frankly insufferable. I saw things in black and white, there were right answers, there were wrong answers, and it was my job to tell you the error of your ways. After years of this kind of debate and convince, I met the Interaction Institute for Social Change, where I now work. And I learned that there are incredible ways to skillfully bring work forward in a collaborative setting. Where I used to slice and dice and argue and interrupt, now I am offering ideas for consideration. I listen to people and ask deep questions. I facilitate dialogue and I teach other people to do the same. It's an incredible gift when you're working on issues as tough as racism to be able to help make it easy for people to think together and decide together and move forward together. It takes a little skill. And it also takes a little knowledge connected to strategy. We've been working with a group that's doing economic opportunity, sort of expanding economic opportunity. They've been bridging young people over the barriers to economic success one by one by one. And as they learned how racism operates, they came to see that they had to do more than that. They're still bridging one by one, but they're also joining with others to help remove those barriers so that one day there won't be a need for their program, or many of them are like that everyone will have the opportunities they need to succeed. So we talked about how networks that have the will, the skill, the knowledge, and the strategy can actually make progress on ending racism, but you might wonder why this matters. And here's what I think. Ending racism is going to free up resources, psychic resources, financial resources, other kinds of resources that we really need to have healthy, vibrant, resilient communities. It's going to make it possible for millions of people who right now can't participate fully to contribute to the wealth of our communities, to the health of our communities. It's going to deepen our empathy and connectedness and help us to build communities that are based in mutual respect and bound together by our shared humanity, even as they are strengthened by our differences. Ending racism is a big job with an even bigger payoff. And we come behind generations who have worked at this, and I believe it is our turn to keep moving that work forward. With the will, the skill, the knowledge, and the strategies, I believe we can get there together. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Glad to see all of you beautiful people. This morning, what we're going to be discussing is a cure for racism. Oh, okay, I'm done. No, in reality, we've all been talking about racism a great deal, but what we haven't really discussed in any meaningful way is what we do to go about bringing an end to it. How do we cure it, right? And I'm using the word cure, ambitious, I know, but it's what I want us to focus on while we talk this morning, okay? So I have a question very quickly. How many of you are prejudiced? Complete trick question. The reality is we are all prejudiced. Okay, now I'm done. Okay. Think of it in this way, right? What role does prejudice play and how does it come about? Well, we start to form these opinions, and if we're talking about prejudice, in reality, these are opinions that aren't founded in any experience. They aren't founded in any substantial contact with that individual or that entity, right? So we actually don't know everything we believe we know about the person. We form this opinion based on typically what we've been told or what we see in front of us, not actual experience. That's prejudice, okay? Separate from racism. Racism is an extreme form of prejudice. And so, when you're thinking about racism, what I want you to focus on and the difference between the two is the malicious intent. Racism, in fact, is act. Discriminatory practices, okay? Let's come back to that. Why do we have so much difficulty talking about racism? Well, often it's the stigma that is associated with the word. When I asked how many of you were prejudiced, the place got very still. I mean, we're talking about several hundred people. I mean, and it literally got still. Not me. Not raising my hand. Maybe he can see me. I can't. But what I want to do in focusing on this topic in A Cure for Racism is to indicate to you that what we're going to use is the science of psychology, right? The idea that I've developed is that racism is in fact a psychiatric illness. It behaves like a psychiatric illness. It looks like a psychiatric illness, falls into those same bounds. And so we can go about treating it and effectively curing it like it's a psychiatric illness. So, if you think about other psychiatric illnesses, what goes from being the general human condition to being a disorder is this spectrum that they fall on. That's all. That's the fundamental root of the practice of psychology. A part of the general human experience is sadness, yes? We all experience it. You've done poorly on a test, someone hits your car, your insurance goes up, someone dies who you love. You don't get into that school you applied to. You got fired from your job. We experience sadness, correct? On the other end of the spectrum of sadness is major depression. And it has its own signs and symptoms. But most of us at some point in our life are going to fall along points of this spectrum. Here over in sadness, I failed the test, somewhere in the middle, someone in my family died, or all the way over to major depression. Same thing for anxiety. On this far end, the general human experience is worry, is nervousness. And on the extreme end is panic, agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder. So let's move it forward because we're talking about racism. So on this end is prejudice, which we've already agreed we all experience. It's part of the general human condition, right? You're walking in the Vista. You see 5 young African-American men wearing hooded sweatshirts coming towards you. Chances are pretty good many of you in here are going to become somewhat nervous, correct? No need to lie about that, folks. I would be somewhat nervous, yes? And so I live in Lexington. If I'm walking along a street in Lexington and I see 5 young Caucasian men and their heads are bald and they have tattoos, I'm going to start to make certain assumptions about them. That's the general human experience of prejudice, right? On the extreme end of that spectrum is racism. The intent to do harm. So if we in fact look at a policy like, say, stop and frisk in New York City, I'm sure you've heard of it. Let me outline it for you. The New York Police Department outlined a practice wherein police officers were directed to stop and literally frisk young African American and Latino men in certain neighborhoods. Specifically, African American and Latino men. What's important there is the power that these police officers have over these men. Racism has to have that intent. I have to be able to do this thing, separate from prejudice. So have you seen where it falls on the spectrum now? Okay. So moving forward, what we've indicated is, well, what I've indicated is we can somehow cure this, yes? It's insidious, and we're all talking about it, and it's harmful. And that's how we know that it's a disorder, but I'm going to call it an illness. It's not enough to call it a disorder because of the stigma involved. And why psychology is so important in this cure is because psychology and psychologists are critical in destigmatizing mental illness. Suicidality became a conversation because of the study and application of work done by psychology and psychologists. Schizophrenia and its science and its study and its practice and application and work and therapy around it, done by psychologists using psychology practices. You're welcome. The understanding that we want to have with regard to using psychology is we're going to take a stage approach to curing racism. The importance of this work extends beyond that though, right? If we're going to work on an individual, we might as well work on ourselves. So I'm pretty sure no one in here has ever done anything racist. But we also want to make this preventative. What's the use of a cure if it can't also help us to stave off illness, right? So 2 stages, curative, preventative. So let's leap right into it, see what we come up with. First, what we have to have, the most critically important part of any practice in curing racism is going to be mindfulness. Knowing that I feel this way and am doing this thing. Being aware of what these signs and symptoms are. How does it impact other people? When I do something, I'm not simply doing it, there's intent behind it, and it's harming someone. Mindfulness. Processing, which is also going to include perspective taking. See, we as a community of thinkers and people are not going to help individuals who are racist recover if we don't, in fact, understand where they are and what their experience is. Yes, there are some racist crimes, but the racists themselves are human beings. The same way someone with drug addiction is a human being who does terrible things but can recover. And if there is no place for them to recover, to come to, if there is no landing spot for their humanity, what are they going to return to? What they were already doing. Exposure. We're going to need to expose ourselves and individuals who are racist to healthier ideas and healthier relationships and healthier ways of being. Lastly, community reintegration and support. Literally, when we bring them back to us, we have to support them. We have to give them ourselves. Okay? Sounds easy, right? You with me on this? Can we do it? Okay. So let me give you an example. And thank you for that over there. When I was a graduate student in New York City, I was a volunteer. And I was working with a young white man who, in fact, was in a juvenile detention center. Now, you can imagine being in any urban center and being white in a juvenile detention center is pretty difficult. He was one of 7 white males in this detention center. There were about 300 of these young men, mostly African American and Latino. So they were literally fighting for their lives every day. So one of the counselors says, listen, you had success with this other guy who was stabbing people. I want you to work with him. Wait a minute. This guy? Now, I knew from a couple of his tattoos and his background this was probably going to be a match made in hell, correct? But I walked in. First thing he says, look, I'm not talking to you. We're done here. Just go on ahead about your business. But we started to talk more. And this is when this idea started to come to me. Okay. First thing, I have to help him to be mindful of his experience while I affirm him. I wasn't going to approach him and say, you know what, you should love all African American people. Even though I may love almost all African American people, the young African American boys who he spent most of his time with were trying to literally beat him to death every day. So I wanted to affirm that reality, but to also say to him, when you get out of here, you're going to go back to some of those relationships you had with African Americans in parts of Queens and Brooklyn, which are healthy. So I want you to acknowledge your reality, but then separate this out. This is contextual. This is happening here. Be mindful of that. Be mindful that your thinking has been impacted by others. A couple of the older boys who in fact were calling themselves skinheads were in his ear every day. Do you see how they are? I can't believe you're working with this guy. This nigga's getting in your head. And so a part of what I then had to do was to say, let's process that. What does that mean to you? What does our working relationship mean to you? What would progress look like? And he started to open up more. He started to be able to identify that our relationship, his relationship with a young African American man, was a healthy one and was supportive, and he was fully engaged. Exposure. This is critically important on both ends. Because in reality, the evidence that we pursue and engage is going to inform our opinion and our psychology. So if I listened to nothing but Southern rap music every day and I was an alien from another planet, I'd be frightened of black people. Frightened, scared to death. If I only looked at pawnbroker wives, I'd be scared of Southern white people. I say all of that to say that what we have to do, must do, then is engage healthier examples. He was able to say to himself and to me, he has a relationship with an African American man from the city who was in his 20s at that time, who was educated, who was a friend. So he was able to begin to access other information. Well, what about that guard who protects me? What about those African American boys who don't jump in when that fight happens? Last thing, community support. Even though he was shaving his head and had these homemade tattoos, he eventually, in less than a year at that point, was going to return to his community. If we, in fact, re-stigmatize racists after we've engaged with them, we give them no opportunity to be a part of the community again. It is the exact opposite of a cure. We are chasing them back toward those symptoms. We are isolating and ostracizing them. We are literally making them unhealthy. And so the urge may be to look at them and say, well, this is a choice. But what we're outlining right now is what evidence there is. That people respond to stimuli and their environment. And that's all he was doing, right? He was released, returned to his community, and for the brief period of time that I was in touch with him, for all intents and purposes, he had at least partially recovered. And so, what we want to do in looking at this cure is not just extreme cases like that. We want to begin to access ourselves. Here's the preventative piece, right? Part of the difficulty I have always had, part of the failure I think we have experienced as a nation and as a society in discussing the issue of race is we have failed to properly educate all of ourselves. We walk into these dynamics, we walk into these settings, and we say, you know what, we need to educate all of the white people. Here's what you're doing wrong, white people. Here's everything you're saying wrong. Here's how you're offending all of us. Just give us some of your power and your privilege and we'll be fine. And what it fails to do is to approach that part of the cure that in fact says, take perspective, process. There are white men and women and people in our community who are scared to say what they think, and we need to affirm them. There are black men and women in our community who are scared to approach, and we need to empower them. And so I'm both fearful and encouraged by where we are, because it feels as if our nation has already started this process to a degree of healing, even in the midst of tragedy. I'm fearful as an African-American man and the father of an African-American son because I have to educate him about these realities and what to expect and what dangers there may be. But I'm encouraged when I look and see entire communities of people, white men and women, Asian, Latino men and women, black men and women, walk out in front of our police with their hands up and say, don't shoot, and Black Lives Matter. And what I see happening is I see people empowering themselves. I see the changes that have occurred. We didn't have a black president elected on just the strength of his community and on communities of color. You may not want to hear that, but it's true. It was a family affair that got that done. What has changed most in our nation is our majority. There have always been talented golden children in the black community and in the brown community, but their brilliance is now being embraced more by our white family. And it's okay if we say that and embrace that and decide that now is the time for us to heal and be cured. Let's go, TEDx, all right? Thank you.